Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome. This is the Multi-CDN Jumpstart. My name is David Hassoun. I'm the CEO and founder of RealEyes Media. We're based in Denver, Colorado. We've been in business over 15 years. I've had the privilege to work with some major customers like NBC Sports, EA Games, Viacom, Oracle, all those goodies. I've worked on major events that are worldwide and record-breaking and all sorts of tiny little things in between. We have a lot of fun working in the video industry, and we have a great team that's done some pretty cool work. And I'm here to talk about some of the multi-CDN strategies out there, some of the providers, the differences in the systems and what they have to offer, and how they can end up adding some good value in different situations, different scenarios, so maybe you can choose the right scenario for what you guys are looking to do as you continue down your multi-CDN journey. So without further ado, let's jump right on in to a little bit. This session is going to kind of be broken up into roughly 4 different categories: the problem, the solution, the challenges, and, well, if you don't like it, build it yourself. And we'll talk about some, at least 1 or 2 kind of strategies that you can look at from a client-side solution of how you could put that together, and what we've had to do for some of our customers in that regard as well. And also going through some really good options that are out there and how they're very different. There's definitely, I'm not going to be going into everyone that has a solution around multi-CDN. What I try to do is find some information about customers that we know, that generally we trust. Not always trust, but that do a good job as well, and understand how they're very different and how they can tackle these problems in different ways. So that's going to be kind of the start, and we'll kind of dive in from there. I'm curious as to if anyone wants to chime in. Multi-CDN, why is this really important to you? Is it the performance side? Is it availability? Or is it just because it's one of those things that you know you're supposed to do? Anyone have a big driver as to why they're here? Yeah.
Well, for example, taking linear distribution over, say, satellite. Seeing if there is an alternative other than satellite, but that's in customers receiving that are used to very robust delivery of signals.
Right.
Not over the internet. How close can you get to that?
Okay, so alternatives to satellite for your top-end distribution and so forth. Okay, cool. Anyone else? There's a big drive as to what you're looking for from a multi-CDN strategy approach. I'm pretty good at tailoring on the fly. All right. Well, we're going to go through a couple different things, and there's also some great people in the room that I recognize. So if anyone ever wants to chime in, has a question, feel free to pop it on, or if you have information that you feel would be valuable to others. So ultimately, we have some issues. The big driver behind going to multi-CDN is a single CDN offers a single point of failure. Regionally, some CDNs might not perform as better as others when we talk about geo distribution, especially worldwide. Sometimes you can have issues at one CDN, essentially, that you might not be having at another CDN, or it could be systematic. You do always have to also consider, hey, is this actually a CDN issue, or is this a last mile issue that we're potentially looking at? Then there's always the wonderful cost consideration and so forth, right? Okay, one might be more cost effective than the other, and if we can maintain a bar for a level of service, then that could also be a benefit for us to potentially shift over users to another one. Ultimately, you can kind of determine your own distribution. This was me making up some numbers as to, okay, what are some of the drivers and what might be those weights for that? Small percentage might be for distributed security, so that you can have separate security for access control and different ones. If one gets compromised, you can easily turn that off and shift over users to alternatives. Availability is usually a pretty big one. Capacity. Performance, though, is usually the #1 winner. Although, of course, in the middle, you always have your cost factors to determine. Once again, not everything is the same cost. Although the playing field has gotten more and more leveled over time, but that also depends on the volume and how much you're utilizing and committing to up front. So those are factors that come into play. So ultimately, there's going to be always different decisions. Really, the #1 thing that we see most time for our customers is that they're really trying to maintain performance and availability. that they want this to be the best experience as possible, and they want to maintain that no matter what happens or where they're trying to deliver. And going from a multi-CDN approach helps, doesn't solve everything, but helps add some robustness in that as well. There's other considerations, though, we have to consider in the general problems that we're going to be facing. There are complexities, especially when we start talking about live streaming. Always, live versus VOD. It's not just, a little bit more complicated. It's usually an order of magnitude more complicated when you're working with live. Unfortunately, that's just the reality. Then you can throw in things like ads and DRM and other stuff, and things just always get more complex. But some of the things we have to consider from a multi-CDN are do we have a single origin? Do we have multiple origins? How do we synchronize content across those origins? That's going to be incredibly important, especially for redundancy and failover and resiliency within the streams, that you need to maintain that and that you have the synchronized stuff. But we've seen also then a lot of issues when you have multiple origins, like, well, there are instances that content won't get synchronized. If content has a problem getting to one origin but then to the other, what are the implications of that? And is that going to then be multiplied within your multi-CDN strategy as well? Or other issues that can happen there, depending on what origins you have serving to what CDNs. Origin load capacity is also something you need to now take into potentially a larger consideration. If you had your own origin server that you were storing your content on, and now you're supporting 5 CDNs, whereas before you were supporting 1, the load on your origin server is going to increase with those different CDNs that are accessing that, unless you're utilizing a service like Fastly or something like that as your kind of origin in itself for your other CDNs. So that's something you just have to really think about. Make sure you're taking into account from capacity planning and so forth. Then we have to start getting into the nuts of it, is how are we actually going to deal with our multi-CDN? Are we going to have traffic routing in there? How do we actually want to move traffic? When to adjust and when not to adjust? Is this going to be upfront or on the midstream? These are other factors, or only when there's a problem. So we'll be diving into some of that. Ultimately, if you're trying to make decisions, you need to have data to make those decisions, right? So are you going to be pulling your QoS and QoE data? Are you looking at the macro view, trying to get information about the CDN from the CDN or from other sources? How do you get that big picture view of what's actually performing well at the CDN perspective, as well as taking that back down to that micro view, that individual user? Is this an issue for that last mile? Are we going to have users individually manage their own CDN switching based off of data that we're able to get that gives us this bigger picture? Or are we going to just group and say, hey, users in this region, we just feel like this is what's going to happen? I see benefits in both routes. I've done a lot more on kind of the individual user level than with the macro level. That's when there's other services that will actually help do that stuff a bit more for you, which we'll be looking at. Access security. One of the challenges that we have all the time is anything that we're delivering over our CDNs, we generally have some form of token access control or whatnot. Even with DRM, we still have customers like, we still want to also have token control, sometimes not. One of the big considerations you have to consider is if I have 3 CDNs and they each have a token authentication system, do I have to align those so they use the same tokens on each? Some of the services out there try to push you to do that. I think that's unfortunate. I think that also potentially reduces the security overall, although if you don't align them, it increases the complexity that you have to manage. Because when you're switching from one CDN to another, and you're trying to do that seamlessly on the user, you have to make sure that you are authenticated in all the appropriate CDNs to be able to do that. Otherwise, you're going to have a problem, and then when it switches, it'll fail. So, cool, we have a few problems. Not really problems, they're challenges, we can overcome them. Let's start talking about some of the solutions and how they work and what are some of the solutions out there. So the solutions really need to kind of cover these 3 different areas. We have how do we make our decisions, how are we going to route our traffic, and the data that we're going to utilize for that, right? That can be kind of part of the decision engine, but the metrics also are driven by how you're routing and what's going on within there. So the decision engine, one can be kind of the DNS or server-based approach, and we'll talk about a couple of solutions that offer in there, or it can be at the client, right? So what we're saying is that, hey, we can deal with all our routing at a service layer higher up that then feeds down to users, and this can be done through DNS so that, hey, all my requests go to one place, and those requests will then be routed to whichever CDN that we want. Or it can be kind of a hybrid approach of other forms of how that's going to be triggering down. Or the client can make those calls based off of data and execute there. That's really the two main routes that we see this. They can be fed through an API service as well. But either way, it's going to be an action that takes place on the client or on the requests that are going upwards. Now, when we look at the traffic router, we can route traffic up front. So the most simplistic way for multi-CDN is you're going to say, hey, before the stream actually begins, there's going to be a decision made, and I'm going to say, hey, user A, you're going to CDN 1. User B, you're going to CDN 1. User C, you're going to go to CDN 2. And that can be based off of region data or other stuff that we want, but we make a call on how we want to distribute our users up front before they start playback. Once they're in playback, we maintain them on that CDN in a basic approach, right? That doesn't mean we have to stop there. We can go further. The other option is you can route that traffic dynamically. So we can, in one case, hard switch users and reload the manifest midstream. So if we're watching content and we're seeing that we're having issues or that it's not performant as well in a specific region or user set, we can say, hey guys, we want you to switch over to alternative content, load in a different one. This is not a good user experience. This is going to be okay, stop, rebuffer, playback begin. I can maintain where I was, but it's not smooth. This isn't something that we generally want to do. This is something that we might do in an emergency when we know, hellfire is about to rain down and bad things are going to happen and puppies are crying all over the world. Ultimately, though, what we prefer to do is do a seamless switch dynamically, switching at the manifest or the segment level. So this would mean taking place either intercepting the request from the client if it's going to a DNS-based solution, or actually changing the client so that, hey, client, don't load from CDN 1, load from CDN 2 on this next request. And that can just be at the segment level, so it's seamless. The user never even knows that they've switched CDNs. Or it can be at the manifest level. If you're doing dynamic manifest manipulations upstream, you can then rewrite the manifest to point it to an alternative path within there. On that next request to the client, it will load that, and then execute the segment request and go appropriately from that. So that's also completely viable. We're going to talk about some benefits and drawbacks and some solutions out there for some of that as well. Either way, for the seamless switching, that could work both for also VOD and live, which is good to note. Automated multi-CDN management, if you want a solution that you don't essentially have to do a lot of work to put it in place, and that becomes a big decision, right? Like you have to decide, like, hey, how much work do we want to do in the client and potentially the server to integrate this, right? All that stuff takes time, takes testing, no matter what you have to test anyway, but it can be a lot of development resource efforts that can take away from other stuff that you have to do. One of these routes for doing this is integrate a system that works with what you have today. A DNS routing and load balancing solution is one route for doing that. Something that you're going to put upstream, and at most you're going to be changing where you're just loading all your content from, and then it will determine and handle that. There are solutions out there for doing that today. They really try to tote like, hey, listen, you don't have to do anything to turn this on. You can just pay us, configure it, and you're set. It's almost true. Not always true, but it's close. The goal is, though, it can definitely reduce the effort that you have to put in. Now, the other option is, we kind of touched on a couple times now, client-side delivery, dynamic manifest or segment selection. This can take a lot more work, or you can find providers out there that can help do this for you already. So client-side implementations, and they've done a pretty good job of keeping those implementations pretty quick and easy to do that. So we'll see and talk about that. StreamRoot's one of the ones that can do some cool stuff with that. So when we look at the DNS load balancing type of side, what this means is that instead of loading from, actually you can still load from your own domain, of course. You're going to work with an organization. One of the biggest ones out there was Sodexis. Now they got purchased by Citrix. Anyone here using Sodexis or Citrix? Anyone know about Sodexis or Citrix? Okay, cool. Anyone scared about Sodexis or Citrix? Okay, cool. Ultimately, you kind of turn over the keys to your car a little bit. and you have a nice little agreement, and they set up a DNS so that when your users say, hey, get me something from my domain, this content, it's going to route through them. They're then going to make a DNS selection and return back content from whichever CDN they think is the right one for you. We're going to see a little bit more on how that works. But that's kind of the concept of the DNS-based one. It can then get more feature-rich and complicated from there. The idea here is you can have automated ruling to determine which one it's to switch to. The distribution can be static, can be based off of failovers, it can be just round robin, it can be weighted round robin, it can be geo-based, it can be performance-based, that's then driven by its QoS and QoE data, or it can even have third-party API integration at some points, as well as having some form of client-side metric reporting. In the perfect world, you're getting both the client, so the individual user and aggregated data, as well as the server-based or network-based monitoring and calculation as well. Now, the other option that we're going to dive a little bit more into is the dynamic manifest segment solution. So this is going to be on either, like I said, a service or client. It's going to be centralized or distributed system with automated rules. It can be API driven, so that can be from an operation or analytics side. When I say operation, one of the things that we've had with some of our customers that they want to do is they want to control it. They want to be able to have their operational staff looking at the data, look at Kavita, look at whatever analytics that they have, look at their own user experiences, and then make the call. Like, hey, I want to be able to push this button and drive users to whatever we want. So you can also integrate that type of stuff as well. This is where it starts coming in like, well, is that going to work with a provider or I have to build something? Same type of concepts. We can do static round robin, weighted round robin, geo-based, and performance-based. But the idea is that this is going to have to start taking place at some point down into the client or into a service that's modifying the actual content that the client's going to be receiving versus just routing what it's going to receive. When we look at the metrics data, client side, one of the key things that we're normally looking at is bandwidth. What's our throughput? Looking for flux, checking for alternatives. That can be on whether it's side loading or polling or doing tag-based checking or failover. Failover is one of the easiest and direct routes to start integrating multi-CDN to your solutions, meaning that if we have a problem, we try out a different CDN, trying to do this so it can also be seamlessly so that it doesn't necessarily impact the user experience. Now that only works if it's not actually a problem on your origin. Otherwise, you're failing over to everything else that also is going to have that same problem. But there's issues that you can kind of catch within there to help with that, and also depending on what your origin setup is. At the service side, most of the time you're looking at some kind of provider, whether it's Conviva, NPA, DataZoom, whatever one and systems that you're out there that are looking to kind of pull and aggregate your data to determine how is the health of your guys' content being distributed out at that time. Aside from that, you can have node check system aggregation. So a node system would be where you have a distributed system that's checking individual files or a set of files and so forth that gives you some data that you can then aggregate. Citrix, Codexis, this is how their system is heavily reliant upon, where they have different node systems all over the world, including then when you implement their system, you put it into your player as well that will go and do node checks and report back of, okay, hey, how is this looking right here in this user at this region? Did it perform at the level that we're expecting? We'll talk about where some weird things can happen with some of that though. Otherwise, you can also check your aggregate client system in general. You can be doing checks against a lot of CDNs offer APIs for their health checks and their throughput. And that's been one of the things that's been really valuable overall is that as multi-CDN has also increased its demand across the industry, CDNs either already had or have continued to offer some robustness around APIs for checking their systems as well and providing some feedback to systems or users. There's always the question of like, is that accurate? But it generally is very good and it offers good, quick insights. So here's a sampling of some of the providers out there that I wanted to talk about and give you guys some insight on. So we have Deliver and Codexis, aka Citrix now, StreamRoot, I put up Peer 5 just recently because they offer something that's a little bit interesting. I don't think it's probably good for most people, but for some it could be really nice. And then Kavita. And these kind of cover a spectrum of stuff that I'm going to kind of dive into a little bit and explain a bit more on them. So first off is Kavita. So they have their precision intelligence system. Kavita is all about the data. They don't do anything, but they provide you information to take action upon. They will not offer you a multi-CDN solution that you can go plug in and it's done. That's not what they do. They provide you all the data from a multi-CDN monitoring and depth perception to be able to execute upon it. That's what they offer. So it's all about an API. It's all about the metrics side only. Then you can plug this into your systems and go from there. The most common approach, and I don't know if I want to say recommended approach from them, is they use this data to be able to allow you to make upfront decisions as to, hey, send users that are about to join to CDN1, or CDN2, or CDN3, et cetera, right? That is their best approach. That's the most effective because they can tell you, hey, right now at this time, go to here. Integrate this into your content management system and feed that data to your users, and it will adjust on the fly and give them, in theory, the best initial video experience that they could have. You can use it for also midstream adjustments if you want to. So, hey, listen, we're starting to see an issue and it's getting really hot. We want to take 30% of our users and start shifting them over to CDN X. You can use their API data to help drive that as well. But once again, you have to have a system in place that's going to then take those actions. Now, Sodexis, they offer one of the more robust systems out there. It's also one of the most expensive. I am not a huge fan of how it works, but that's more of a personal thing. They collect information from over 50,000 different networks daily, 130 clouds, and 14 billion RUM data points every day. They have nodes check systems all over. And if you utilize their system, and I think they require, and it's part to also feed it, that you have to put a little bit of client-side code in that's also going to be doing node checks, meaning that it's going to be pulling some data and checking the performance on that. They also then aggregate this to give you, this live radar view of the internet at any time. Let's see if it can load up for us. We'll show you what's going on where do we see greatest congestion or issues. Come on. It normally looks really cool. All right. Blame conference internet for now. We can always come back to it. See, there might be, I would hope that they would show a nice red dot, and it's not going to work. Anyway, point is they gather a ton of data and then try to use that. One of the things that I don't like, so I was watching the Super Bowl from CBS not too long ago, and I was watching the network traffic and just seeing how things were kind of going. And I know they were using Sodexis, and I could see the polls going out for their node checks and so forth. And they were actually doing some fairly large chunk checks. And they were impacting some of the performance of their playback sometimes when they were doing that, because they'd hit it and they'd hit like 4 different requests right in a row they were going up to a couple megs. Something was getting a little funky with what they were doing, but it could have a negative impact because of how they were doing some of the checks. Plus, you have to then figure out how does that information get aggregated and so forth. There's some other factors that go with it. But it can be incredibly valuable. The benefit of the Sodexis stuff is that once you get it configured and you route your DNS traffic through them, this is a mostly turnkey type of solution to integrate. There's a tiny bit of client-side code for the validation, and not so much validation, it's some of the metric gathering and the node stuff. But it can provide a pretty powerful system in place. And you don't have to do very much. And it's driven by a lot of data from across the network. It's very expensive from what I'm told. I haven't actually had a chance to talk with them through the pricing and stuff, but it can be valuable. Some of the biggest players out there are definitely using them, and some of them aren't. But they are a great option for kind of a bigger approach. Deliver is something similar, but a little different. So I wanted to also put them up here for a bit of contrast. So what Deliver does is they also do a DNS-based solution. So you point your stuff so it will route through them. And taking a pause, anyone have a feeling as what's some of the downside of these DNS solutions? Right? One of the big things up front we said with this is, hey, we don't want to put all our eggs in one basket. Right? Now, if we're turning over our DNS to go through someone else, are we essentially exchanging one daemon for another? That's a concern. And for those people who are very sensitive to risk, that is something that does actually come up into play in key discussions. They had, I think, some issues early on with some potential for that. If something does get overloaded, it could then cause an issue, and then everything's down. There's been, I think, both with Sodexis and Deliver have put in stuff in place that it can have automatic failover, so it can revert back to defaults. But there's still some level of potential inherent risks with that, and that makes some people also very just anxious in doing something like that. But Deliver, how they are a little bit different is they offer ability, instead of just routing the individual requests, they actually modify the manifests. They modify the manifests, and they have this little trademark responsive manifest for each video request made to a Deliver host name. The modified manifest is going to have the start video segments that are actually be delivered from Deliver. So instead of being delivered from your CDN, the first 1 to 3 segments of each video are actually going to be sent from Deliver, and they're going to use that as one of their main key metric monitoring points. Now, they boast that, like, listen, we can deliver as well as any CDN for these small volumes because we're not doing it at super high volume. I imagine Akamai might want to argue that, but there are challenges with some of that. So far, from customers I know that have used them, they've had pretty good delivery from their stuff that they're sending out. In most part, it works pretty good. What they do, aside from that little polling on those first couple ones, is they're actually checking a lot of things going on within the CDN as requests are flowing through their system, as well as looking at the manifest requests to also determine are things being delayed, are things adding up into buffer scenarios. They've done some pretty cool stuff to do some interpretive and prescriptive logic around what they believe is happening at the individual clients and aggregate that based off of the requests that the clients make. So they can say, hey, okay, if we know this is a 6-second segment and they're now having a greater delay between requests, we know that we have potential that it's either being buffering or other stuff. They do some really cool logic within there, and it can work out well. The downside, some people really don't like the fact that they end up delivering some more of the content. They can start picking up and deliver more of the content, not just in the very beginning. They'll pick up a little bit here and there and pull that out. And that factor can be a negative implication because they start picking up more of that traffic. And there are systems that doesn't necessarily make as much sense, and they can't necessarily perform as well, especially if you're like on a Comcast user on a Comcast network. Is that really going to be the most optimal route, getting content delivered from Deliver and AWS potentially versus off of the actual Comcast CDN? But they try not to do it too much, and it can offer an interesting control. One thing that's interesting, I'm going to jump to the last point, is that Deliver really tries to be a cost-neutral approach. Their big cost point is what they're doing is they're going to charge you on what they deliver off their network, which is going to be smaller segments. But they try to make that so that in the end, it doesn't really cost you anything. That the amount that you're going to save because what was not delivered over the CDN is what you're going to be paying to them. They do that. In theory, it works out well. The downside is they can end up delivering more of that traffic. I don't know the exact numbers. I've heard they can get up to almost like an eighth or a quarter of the traffic that end up being routed through them. So that can be an interesting factor. depending on that. And I can get more information for anyone who wants to talk with them and so forth. What they kind of offer as what their competitive advantage over tag-based measurement, and tag-based measurement is more the Sodexis stuff. Simple integration, no client-side code or tags required. There's nothing you have to put in the client for deliver. That one, they really try to make it as, listen, you don't have to do really anything. You set this up, you point us over, we do the configuration, and you now have multi-CDN. They don't, they have really pretty robust CDN decisioning. They've talked about also integrating with Kavita for the Precision API as well, or other ones. You can set up your own business rules and so forth. Sodexis can do that as well. Real end user measurements of video streams based off your actual video streams. This is actually one of the key points I like, is instead of trying to use non-video tag-based management, so these files that aren't video, that's what Sodexis is going to be utilizing to determine what's going on. They're actually using your video segments to make the decisions. So measuring on what's actually going to be delivered does have some potential extra value. And they also really tote that because of that, CDNs can't spoof it. They claim that they've, at least based off these statements, and I think from what they've seen, is that CDNs, they want to always look like they're doing the best. And since Will Law left the room, I can talk a little more freely. But one of the things that is said that some CDNs have been caught doing is they will actually prioritize some of that traffic that they know is being used to continuously check the CDN health, and therefore give false data to things like Sodexis that are trying to leverage that to determine which CDN to select. CDNs have that power. Now, whether or not they choose to abuse it, I can't really say. I haven't seen that, but that is definitely a concern. My bigger concern being is if you're always checking a certain type of file versus these longer chunks of files, checking a 200 kilobyte file versus a 2 megabyte video file aren't always the same thing, and what you're going to actually get through your throughput, let alone your cacheability and so forth. Now, another one, which is very different. Now we're leaving the wonderful world of DNS-based systems behind and looking at the alternatives on the client side. Is Compass. Compass is a solution by StreamRoot. Great company. They do some really cool stuff. They offer a solution in client side. So you can pop this into your client. This isn't based off of having to have your DNS changeover and so forth. And they will then intercept and adjust requests on the fly for individual segments and swap there. Becomes super cool in that regard because you're not having to change your overbearing routing system. And it can still do segment-based ones. You have good control over the ruling, and the implementation is actually pretty simple. We actually implemented this a couple weeks ago, and it was within an hour or two. It was in and working. We've also worked with them to help handle some very complex solutions for the future in regards to dynamic ad insertion, multi-token authentication, and so forth that come into play. So they've had some good forethought in what's going on there. The downside on some of this is support across all platforms, right? Right now, I know they have really solid support on all the web-based platforms, and I know they have support moving forward on some of the native platforms. Is it iOS yet? Yeah, iOS. But it's not on all platforms yet. But I think they're working towards that. Another one that's similar is Peer 5. Similar concept. They're on less platforms, just web for right now. I don't know if they're going to be moving towards the other platforms anytime soon. What's different about these guys is if you have no CDN yet and don't have a lot going on too far into your player, they can offer some solutions that just take care of it all for you. You don't get to bring your own CDNs to this market. They're like, no, you want to use our service? We got the CDNs already covered. We're just going to help deliver out your content. Don't worry about it. So if you need kind of a, hey, listen, I'm just starting something out. I don't have CDN agreements. I don't want to deal with that. Then Peer 5 is good. Otherwise, they're not going to be the right one probably for you. So those cover some of the spread of options that you can find for solutions out there. The big ones being Sodexis. or Deliver are the top two, in my opinion, for the DNS type stuff. StreamRoot is great for a client one if you want to be able to implement that, as long as you're not looking to hit all targets for platforms out of the box. When we look at some of the challenges, you do have to consider what's your implementation strategy. Is that going to be an issue? What are the supported platforms that you're looking to really target? Stream-based measurement or tag-based measurement. I definitely recommend, if possible, stream-based measurement, but tag is a solution. Platform-specific capabilities and support. Whether or not you want to also have what we refer to as user-select CDNs, although it's probably a better term would be in-network CDNs. So one of the challenges we have, one of our customers is, yes, they use Akamai, Limelight, CenturyLink, top three, as well as potentially some other ones. But they also have agreements in place for companies like Comcast. Comcast has their own CDN. Comcast CDN is meant for Comcast customers. If you're at home and you pay for Comcast internet, if you get content off of the Comcast network, you are going to probably kick everyone else's butt, at least from a performance standpoint, because they control all of that. But that only works if you're a Comcast customer. So we actually have to sometimes do a check and say, hey, is this user right now, wherever they are on the Comcast network? Oh, they are? Cool. Actually, let's prioritize the Comcast network before we try to send stuff over to Akamai or CenturyLink. So those can add in interesting complexities. That can also be taken down even to the mobile level. Verizon also has their own CDN. If you're on a Verizon device and you're connected and you try to actually be able to access content, if you get it from the Verizon network, you in theory can have a good performance benefit. Those type of things also can add a complexity. So if you are going with a multi-CDN strategy and you are looking to leverage those or have agreements in place to also be leveraging those, keep those in mind and talk to the providers of whoever you're going to work with, or if you're building out a solution, to deal with that. Dynamic ad insertion. This is something you need to definitely consider when you're talking about, okay, cool, we have an ad. Which CDN do I load that from? Do I try to load that from the CDN that I'm already on? And if so, how do we make adjustments for that? That's something that a lot of the systems try to just kind of look over and like, don't worry about it, it'll be fine. This can be a big challenge and something you have to work through. There is things in place that they're starting to have better support for that you can either do alignment on there. If you're doing the DNS stuff, then it should work out fine, but then you also have to make sure you keep that in mind into your ad decisioning engines and so forth, that they're also playing well with it. Otherwise, if you're doing a client solution, that's something you have to be very careful of, is how is that going to impact your ad selection as well, or should it, or do you want to keep those separate? But then keep that in mind for your metrics that you gather as well. Security, access, token auth, whether you have to get new tokens on switching, whether you do that up front. One of the things that we found is our customers didn't want to have unified token across them. I think the Sodexo stuff, I don't know if they require it, but I know they pushed hard for it on their customers. That, listen, if you're using token auth, you have to have the exact same tokens work across your different CDNs. That does make your life a heck of a lot easier. However, there's challenges with that, both on both the CDN configuration and some CDNs, whether or not they're going to support that, whether they're going to support the long tokens for that, or whether you're doing tokens in the path, which then has other potential issues. Or if you're not, how are you going to handle that when it tries to switch to CDN? So there's a couple things that we'll talk about in a minute that you can do to consider for some of that and handle some things at the client layer if you do have different tokens across different CDNs. Our customers like having different tokens. They have that always been that case. Once again, it can offer additional layer of security-ish. Whether or not it's worth the headache is something that's always worth considering. And also, if you ever do a hard push of all your users, if you're seeing that there's an issue on CDN 1 and you're going to just try to move all your users to CDN 2, be careful. If you're working on large events, moving a very large number of users too quickly to an alternative CDN could have negative implications. You can cause a stampede, which would potentially give you far degraded service on that CDN while it tries to warm up all the regional caches and their POPs. So if you do a system in which case you're going to be switching users over, one of the things we built in years ago for one of our players is they could do redirects. Like, okay, we're seeing issues, we want to redirect the users to another location. You could have it where it's going to execute it immediately, although what we also built in is that you could specify a duration. So we could say, hey, over the next 5, 10 minutes, whatever, 30 minutes, start randomly moving people over. And that's easy logic that you can do on the client. You just say, hey, generate a number between 1 and however many seconds, and set a timeout, wait until that executes, and then do your move over. And that's a good way to kind of delay things out a little bit. Now, if we want to go a little bit further into potentials and how you could even build it, a clean route, if you want to do something, and you want to do it at the client layer, is you can do it with your manifests, and you can adjust what's going to happen within there. So upfront manifest creation logic. You can do this at the server as well. I'm going to kind of talk with it as if it was in the client, but the concept works either way. The server is great if you're going to be doing this at a larger scale grouping. Client is good if you want to have a more individual-based distribution. But the idea here is you can generate a dynamic master manifest merged from multiple individual CDNs. So if we have our CDN1, CDN2, CDN3 master manifest, we can take those and merge those into one single master manifest. And based off of whichever one we want to order first will be the CDN that the user starts on. Then the clients, by default in HLS World, will automatically be able to fail over to any other CDN if they have a problem, and it'd be seamless. So you can leverage some of the inherent capabilities within HLS to easily have a multi-CDN failover system, and you don't have to build anything special into the player logic. So all the normal player cores out there that support HLS will do rendition set switching whenever they hit an issue. Sometimes you'll have to extend things a little bit to cover a broader spectrum of errors, but this is something that you can do very directly and offers a baseline level for an implementation that can work out well. Also can support multiple origins, can use analytic APIs for your decision if you want to, or use something like precision up front and be able to go from there. We've done things like, okay, great, we can have 50% of users go to CDN1, 25% of users go to CDN2, 25% of users go to CDN3, do that on the logic side of the client and adjust for it. So what does this end up looking like? Well, we have our wonderful dynamic master playlist that we're going to create that we're going to be using from pulling off from our different top-level manifests that point to the stream-level manifest. We take these top-level manifests and we can just copy those in there into one and then feed that to our player core. That will allow us so that if any one of these ends up having an issue, it will automatically and seamlessly fail over to the next one. That is a pretty quick and dirty way to have a so if you have multiple origins, this is what this would look like. So it's just an idea that you have origin 1, origin 2, and for different CDNs, you can then duplicate that. You can then determine, do you want to try, hey, go from origin 1 to origin 2, or do you want to go from origin 1, CDN1 to CDN2, or flip it. You can actually go to CDN2, origin 2 if you have a problem. By just specifying the vertical order will determine its failover scenario that you can take place. What the actual manifest would look like is something like this. This one indicating that we're going to fail over between CDN1 to CDN2 to CDN3, giving priority to CDN1. Now, you can take this same type of concept further if you want to. And what you can actually do is instead of being very explicit and saying, hey, everything, just do this in this order, if you want to get things more complicated, and this is where things like the stream group stuff have dealt with some of this stuff for you guys already, but if you really want to own and take care of something on the client or manifest layer, this would really need to be more on the client side, is you can actually just start doing proxies. So what you actually feed to your player isn't actually going to be a full path to any content. It will have a partial path, the end portion, the beginning portion for which CDN that you want to leverage. You would just put in some kind of key, and then you would swap that out. So when it actually goes to make the request, you swap it out for whichever one you want to use based off of logic. If you do something like this, it's still good to have multiple rendition sets so that you can use the inherent failover logic within the HLS player cores. So if it has a problem, it'll attempt to go to the alternative, in which case that gives you a seamless route for switching over instead of it trying to do a re-request. Since a lot of the player cores sometimes will attempt to do a switch over after one failure request. So with this one, the manifest would look like something more like this, where you've actually replaced out your base path. You can keep your file path, and then you can just have a primary and secondary You do that for each one of your renditions. And then in your player logic, you actually, any type of request is going out for a manifest or a segment level, you could then replace this if you want to on the fly. And that can work out pretty well. This gets a little bit more complicated, though, in what you have to build out. But it can be a pretty quick solution. And then this one you can use to drive dynamically by any data that you want, whereas the previous one is only going to be doing it on failover. So here you can say we've now seen, based off of our analytics data, that we're having degraded issues for users in certain region, and be able to adjust those users at the client. So there's a number of options out there. Really, there's going to be different ones based off of what your use case are, what your tolerance is for how much implementation you have to do, what your cost level you want to go is, and how you want to go about it. Generally speaking, Deliver offers a great solution that's theoretically cost neutral, meaning that it shouldn't cost you anymore if you're already leveraging multiple, already have a CDN arrangement and you want to work with multiple, and is DNS based, but know that some of the traffic is going to be going through them. But it also gives you quite a bit of control as well. If you want to go with the client solution, StreamRoot has a great one that's out of box. You can also work towards building one. We've built some in the past as well. It just depends on what target platforms you're trying to hit and so forth. The stuff that we built out, we've utilized some of the manifest manipulation at the client. We've built that across all the primary platforms. Roku, no, but at least not yet. But we've built that type of stuff out for iOS, tvOS, Android, Fire TV, and web across the board. So there's some good options out there, and it just depends on where you want to go with it. I have a bunch of resources that I've posted up if you guys want, also from any of our other presentations that our team's doing out here. If you go to just bit.ly/RE-SME2019, all lowercase, you can tell us which stuff you want. We can send you some goodies. And if you have any further questions, you can also post them on there. We do have some time right now, though. If you guys have any questions regarding, hey, listen, I'm trying to do this, or what about that, I'm happy to try to answer them for you. Yes?
So for the master theory, basically merge all the manifests from different CDNs. How do you control the percentage of traffic to different CDNs?
Sure. So the question was, when we are merging our manifest to do this kind of base level, at least multi-CDN failover system, how do we determine, control the percentages of which one's going to go where? So this works really well for upfront user selection. So meaning that, hey, we want 50% of users to go to CDN 1 and 25 maybe for the other two. How we do that is we have to get data to tell us how we want to distribute that. So we want 50% for CDN 1, 25 for CDN 2, CDN 3. On the client, or if you're doing this at the server, essentially on each request we'll determine, okay, at a client base, generate a random number between 100 and 1. Based off of where that falls, we'll determine which one to put first. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but the first one is only the initial.
Yeah, so this only works for initial selection. So the idea here is go with the initial, and then if it has any problems, it's going to fail over, and then we can just also, if we want to, have logic determined in there of how it will potentially prioritize its failover. So, okay, we want you to go from CDN 1 to CDN 3 or CDN 1 to CDN 2 as your prioritization path. The one thing you have to watch out with this is that this will do a great seamless failover if it has an error on any request, right? On Android, just so you know, if you end up trying to do something like this, you do have to extend things a little bit. By default, it doesn't cover 500 errors, and it will only do a 404. You can extend that so it goes further, though, within Exoplayer. We also, I think, already put up a fork on that as well. But those type of things you have to watch out for as to what are your conditions that it's going to use to trigger to go to the alternative rendition set. Yes?
What performance benefits do you typically see with an Exos type solution? Data rate throughput or whatever metric you want to use?
It really depends on which CDNs you're leveraging and what regions. I mean, ultimately, you're asking like, well, what's the delta that you're going to potentially get with a multi-CDN approach for performance improvement? It varies so much. Where people see the greatest benefit is when there's very large scale events or other things that are potentially going on, whether they're going on by someone else at the same time in the same region or not, because that's when you start seeing a bigger delta between the two. If one network's getting saturated, then you can have a 20 to 30% potential improvement over CDN 1 to CDN 2. Most cases, though, it's going to be a much smaller percentage from my limited experience in seeing what those numbers look like.
You talk about the expense, but if there's actually a return on it, if there's the benefit of that expense,
Right.
then actually, obviously people are willing to pay it. Right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they must be giving an ROI on that.
Yeah. So,
Better than they actually maybe you think or.
yeah. I'm going to put a link on here. I have a couple reports that I've seen from events as to what's actually been able to come out. I need to make sure that they can be shared, but I'll add this to the resources as well. That's where, like I said, where we've seen is that it can reduce your rebuffers as a big factor, which has a cost benefit. If you're having network throughput input issues and or help with video start times, that's where we generally see it. But you can get a considerable amount, but it really depends on the networks and the timing of what you're really doing. For large-scale events, things like the Super Bowl and so forth, yeah, it has real good monetary value because the performance benefit that they're going to get and the lack of loss of traffic, potentially, because of that, right? Bad experiences mean you lose users. Losing users means you lose money. By retaining those, that's the benefit. And there's some good data that can be seen, like, okay, this is what happened on this network, and it switched over this quickly. We avoided, what we historically know would have cost us 15% of our users.
You mentioned it, but could you comment a little further on the effects of dynamic ad insertion on this?
The challenges come down to what do you want it to do and what are the implications with it. Where we've saw challenges are more on the client-side implementations and the considerations you have to take into account there. But historically, like one of the things that also is concerning that you have to watch out for on some of the dynamic ad insertion is that, like when we normally look at throughput and performance and so forth, like with content, we see pretty good, nice, steady, things are looking good. Ads get bad. Part of that is because cacheability. Everybody's watching the same thing and all this, and then we have ads that might be also regional based, and they're not going to be pre-cached and other stuff. So if your decisioning logic is also very sensitive, you have to be keeping in mind how you want to adjust for it during ads, or you can end up doing a CDN switch, thinking that, oh, well, we have a problem now. No, it's just an ad. It's going to take it's going to be a little bit slower, and you don't want to have things switching too much because of that, let alone if you're doing a larger scale one. Otherwise, it's the biggest challenge to determine, like, where do you want to load that ad from? Do you want it synchronized with your multiple CDN approach that you already have in place? Or is it better to load them all from one CDN so we have a potentially better hit rate for our cache if we have normally using a distributed CDN, and determining from there. Those are the factors that you normally have to really kind of watch out for as the bigger ones. Server-side ad, it would still potentially be an issue determining which solution you have in place. If you're using like a Sodexis or Deliver and you're doing server-side ads, it should still do fine with it will align the CDN to whichever your content is, at least it should be, depending on how you have stuff configured, and it shouldn't be an issue. Once again, though, it just matters on if you have a client-side quality of service metric that's triggering your CDN switches, you have to be careful of knowing when you're in an ad break and potentially loosening those rules around that. Because that's something that's easy to overlook. Okay, great. When we hit these type of metrics, we know we want to switch to CDN. Watch out and look at your ad load and see how that actually normal spikes are with that before you make that call. And the best route is to know, like, in an ad break, we have these realms. In content, we have this realm. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you, everyone.